Tonight we descend into the spaces between what was written and what was lost, into the chambers where knowledge accumulated for centuries before vanishing in single nights of fire or flood, into the harbors where ships once anchored before the waters rose and claimed the docks, the warehouses, the temples built to bless departures and welcome returns, into the silence where voices spoke languages that no living ear can now understand, where hands wrote symbols that no living eye can now read, where civilizations flourished and fell and left only fragments for us to puzzle over in the darkness before sleep. This is not a journey toward conclusions, not a march through facts arranged in tidy sequence. This is a wandering, slow, meditative, uncertain, through the ruins of human achievement and the mysteries those ruins contain. We will visit places that scholars debate and places that scholars have abandoned to legend. We will examine objects that should not exist and texts that describe events that should not have happened. We will sit with contradictions that cannot be resolved, with questions that cannot be answered, with silences that speak louder than the words surrounding them. The world has forgotten much. The libraries that burned took knowledge that cannot be recovered. The civilizations that collapsed took languages that cannot be reconstructed. The waters that rose took cities that cannot be excavated. The forests that grew back took temples that cannot be found. What remains is partial, is fragmentary, is like a conversation heard through walls. We catch phrases, sense meanings, but cannot reconstruct what was fully said. Yet what remains is also wondrous. The fragments speak of capabilities we did not expect ancient peoples to possess. The ruins reveal sophistication that challenges our assumptions about progress, about development, about the relationship between past and present. The mysteries invite us not to solve them, but to sit with them, to feel their weight, to recognize that knowledge is always incomplete, and that completion is perhaps not the point. Tonight, we visit 12 sacred spaces of uncertainty, 12 chambers where what was lost still echoes, 12 moments where the past reaches toward us through fog and darkness, offering not answers but presence, not conclusions but company. The journey is long, the path is winding, the destination is not arrival but contemplation. Let the evening deepen. Let the world outside grow quiet. Let the archives of the drowned and the forgotten open their water-damaged pages, their smoke-stained scrolls, their stone tablets worn smooth by centuries of wind, and wondering, the stories wait. The mysteries persist. The night is patient. Let us begin. We begin at the edge of water and memory, where the land surrenders to the sea, and the sea keeps secrets the land has forgotten. The harbor of Dwarka lies 40 feet beneath the waves of the Arabian Sea, off the coast of Gujarat in western India. For millennia, it existed only in sacred texts. The Mahabharata described it as the kingdom of Lord Krishna, a city of gold and crystal of 900,000 palaces and gardens that made heaven envious. Scholars classified it as mythology. Believers kept faith. The sea kept silent. Then, in the early 2000s, marine archaeologists descended with sonar and cameras into the turbid waters. What they found was not the city of gold. Such things exist only in Scripture's imagination, but something perhaps more remarkable, evidence of human settlement extending far out into what is now open sea, stone structures arranged in geometric patterns, anchors of a design unknown in modern India, pottery shards dating to periods that pushed habitation back further than expected. The legendary Dwarka may not have been literally true, but something had been there. Something had built. Something had been drowned when the waters rose at the end of the last ice age, or when earthquakes shifted the coastline, or when the sea simply claimed what had been built too close to its reach. The fog that rises from these waters is not merely meteorological, it is epistemological, a fog of not knowing that science can thin, but cannot entirely dispel. We cannot say with certainty that the submerged structures are Krishna's city. We cannot say with certainty that they are not connected to the legends that preserved Dwarka's name through 30 centuries of telling. We can only say that something was there, that it was lost, that the sea has held it in silent custody while generations above debated whether it had ever existed at all. Dwarka is not alone in its drowning. Along coastlines worldwide, settlements lie submerged, victims of sea level rise that followed the last glacial maximum, victims of earthquakes and tsunamis, victims of subsidence and erosion, and the simple truth that water is patient and stone is not. Heraklion, the great Egyptian port that welcomed Greek traders before Alexandria was founded, rested beneath 30 feet of Mediterranean water until its rediscovery in 2000. Divers found statues still standing, inscriptions still legible, offerings still arranged before gods who had waited in darkness for 2,000 years. The city had sunk gradually, had been abandoned incrementally, had slipped beneath the waves so slowly that the final departure may have felt less like catastrophe than like the end of a long illness, expected and almost welcomed. Pavlopetri, off the southern coast of Greece, may be the oldest submerged city ever discovered, 5,000 years old. Its streets and buildings preserved by the gentle chemistry of Mediterranean water, its layout suggesting urban planning that should not have existed so early. The city had cemeteries, had marketplaces, had what appear to be shrines. Its people had organized space deliberately, had thought about how communities should be arranged, had created patterns that archaeologists recognize because we still build cities according to similar principles. Then the sea rose, or the land sank, and Pavlopetri became reef, became rumor, became visible only when the water is exceptionally clear and the sun strikes at the proper angle. The harbors we build are negotiations with water. We extend docks toward ships, but the sea extends itself toward us in return. We dredge channels, but silt fills them again. We construct seawalls, but storms test them, and storms eventually win. The drowned harbors are reminders that the negotiation is not between equals, that water has time, that stone does not, that coastlines are temporary drawings the sea will eventually erase. What did the pool tosi putko abiekuta Dwarka see as the waters rose? Did they watch over generations as familiar rocks became submerged, as beaches they had known since childhood retreated inland, as temples built by their grandparents required longer and longer walks to reach? Did they tell stories about a golden age, when the land extended further, when the harbor was deeper, when ships from lands they could no longer name brought goods they could no longer identify? Did they know they were living through the drowning, or did it happen too slowly for a single lifetime to measure? The fog rolls in as we contemplate these questions, the kind of fog that softens edges, that makes distant things disappear, that suggests the boundary between sea and sky is as uncertain as the boundary between legend and history. Somewhere beneath us, if we imagine ourselves floating above the waters off Gujarat, the stones of ancient settlement wait. Fish swim through doorways. Crabs inhabit what might have been temples. The anchors of ships that sailed 4,000 years ago hold fast to sea floor that was once dry land, once harbor, once the place where journeys began and ended. The sailors who used those anchors are forgotten. Their names are lost. Their languages have evolved into forms they would not recognize, but their anchors remain, holding nothing now, securing ships that rotted millennia ago, maintaining positions in harbors that exist only in the memory the sea keeps but does not share. Other harbors join this meditation as sleep approaches. Port Royal in Jamaica, the pirate haven that sank during an earthquake in 1692, its streets and taverns preserved beneath Caribbean waters, its wickedness and its commerce equally entombed. The harbor of ancient Carthage, once rival to Rome, now partially submerged, its military ports still traceable beneath Tunisian waters, the countless small harbors of the North Sea coast, villages that serviced fishing fleets before the waters rose and claimed them, their names preserved only in documents that describe places that no longer exist above the waves. The fog thickens. The distinction between what is seen and what is remembered grows uncertain. In this uncertainty, the harbors speak, not in words, but in presence, in the weight of what was built and what was lost, in the recognition that human industry is impressive and human impermanence is absolute. We build toward the water builds toward us. In the end, the water keeps what it takes. Rest now with the thought of anchors holding fast to nothing, of ships that completed their final voyages into depths their captains never intended, of harbors that welcomed generations of departures and arrivals before welcoming the sea itself, the final arrival, the guest that never leaves. The fog settles, the waters darken, The forgotten harbors keep their silent watch, and somewhere in the depths, in the spaces between legend and history, the cities that drowned continue their slow surrender to salt and time and the patient work of forgetting. In Baghdad, during the golden age of Islamic civilization, there stood a house of wisdom, not a metaphor, an actual institution, the Bait al-Hikmah, where scholars gathered to translate, to debate, to create knowledge that would shape the world for centuries. The library breathed. This is not poetry. This is description. The rustle of thousands of scrolls, the murmur of scholars in Indian languages, the scratch of reed pens on paper, paper itself, a technology recently arrived from China, created a continuous respiration and inhalation of knowledge from across the known world, and an exhalation of wisdom that would travel further still. The Caliph al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833, reportedly dreamed of Aristotle. In the dream, the philosopher spoke to him, told him that reason and revelation were not enemies but allies, that the wisdom of the Greeks was compatible with the truths of Islam, that knowledge was the inheritance of all humanity regardless of which prophet they followed. Whether the dream was genuine vision or political justification, its effect was the same. Al-Mamun launched a translation movement unprecedented in scale, sending agents to Constantinople and beyond to acquire manuscripts, paying translators their weight in gold, creating institution that would preserve and extend human knowledge through centuries when other centers of learning dimmed or disappeared. What was translated in Baghdad? Everything the scholars could find. The works of Plato and Aristotle, previously known to the Islamic world only in fragments. The medical texts of Galen, whose anatomical observations would influence doctors for 1,000 years. The mathematical treatises of Euclid, whose geometry still structures how we think about space. The astronomical tables of Ptolemy, whose Earth-centered cosmos would not be displaced until Copernicus. The texts came in Greek, in Syriac, in Sanskrit, in Persian, and emerged in Arabic, the scholarly language of an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia. But the House of Wisdom was not merely translation factory, it was crucible of creation. Scholars did not simply render Greek texts in Arabic, they corrected them, extended them, argued with them across centuries. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra there. The word itself comes from the title of his treatise, and his name gives us algorithm. Scholars calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. They mapped the stars, improved astronomical instruments, developed surgical techniques, explored optics, debated philosophy with a sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for 500 years. The breathing of this library was the breathing of civilization itself, the collective respiration of minds working together across linguistic and cultural boundaries, inhaling the wisdom of predecessors and exhaling knowledge for successors. The sound must have been extraordinary. The turning of pages, the debates in corridors, the occasional exclamation when a scholar discovered something unexpected in a newly translated text. The smell must have been equally distinctive. Paper and ink, the oil lamps that allowed work to continue into night, the bodies of scholars who sometimes forgot to eat in their absorption with texts, and then the breathing stopped. In 1258, the Mongol army of Hulagu Khan besieged Baghdad. The siege was brutal, the conquest more brutal still. Medieval sources describe horrors that may be exaggerated, but were certainly substantial. Hundreds of thousands killed, the caliph executed, the city sacked for weeks, and the library, the house of wisdom itself, was destroyed. Some accounts claim the books were thrown into the Tigris in such quantities that the river ran black with ink before it ran red with blood. Other accounts suggest the destruction was less theatrical but equally complete. What is certain is that when the Mongols left, the library no longer breathed. What was lost? We cannot know with precision. We know what survived because it had already been copied, had already traveled to other libraries in Cordoba or Cairo or Constantinople. But what had not yet been copied? What texts existed in single exemplars, waiting for the scribes who would never come? What knowledge accumulated over 4 centuries of scholarship disappeared in a few weeks of destruction? The loss echoes through history. When European scholars rediscovered Greek philosophy through Arabic translations, they found texts that had been preserved in Baghdad, that had traveled from the House of Wisdom to Spain to Paris to Oxford. The Renaissance was built partly on foundations that Islamic scholars had maintained, had translated, had extended. But what might the Renaissance have been if more had survived? What scientific discoveries might have come earlier? What philosophical insights might have shaped different trajectories? The questions are unanswerable, and perhaps that is the point. The breathing of the library represented possibility, the accumulated potential of human knowledge, the conversations that texts enable across centuries, the slow building of understanding that requires preservation as much as creation. When the library burned, when the books drowned in the Tigris, possibilities died that cannot be resurrected. Trajectories were altered that cannot be traced. Silences were created that cannot be filled. Other libraries join this meditation. The Library of Alexandria, most famous of lost libraries, whose destruction may have been gradual rather than sudden, whose holdings may have dispersed rather than burned, but whose loss nonetheless represents knowledge that future generations would have to rediscover or do without. The libraries of Mesoamerica, where Maya and Aztec codices were burned by Spanish priests who saw in them only paganism, who could not read the astronomical observations and historical records and philosophical speculations that the books contained. The libraries of China, burned during various dynastic transitions, particularly during the Qin unification, when the first emperor allegedly destroyed texts that contradicted his ideology. Each burning is an amputation. Each lost library represents not just books, but the conversations those books enabled, the scholars who might have read them, the insights that might have emerged from minds encountering ideas across centuries. The House of Wisdom breathed for 400 years. Its breathing created reverberations that still shape our world. Algebra, algorithms, the transmission of Greek philosophy, the development of scientific method. But its silencing also shapes our world. Through absences we cannot fully identify, through knowledge we had to rediscover because the chain of transmission was broken. Rest now with the thought of scholars in lamplight bent over manuscripts, translating worlds of reed pen scratching symbols that would carry meaning across continents and centuries. Of debates in corridors where Arabic and Greek and Persian mingled in the service of understanding. Of the last librarian, perhaps, carrying what scrolls he could as the city burned around him, walking into a world that would slowly forget what had breathed there. The library is ash now, the wisdom dispersed or destroyed, but the breathing continues in what survived, in what was copied before the end, in what traveled far enough to escape the flames. We inherit that breath. We carry those words. And in the darkness before sleep, we might hear it still, the rustle of pages, the murmur of scholars, the respiration of civilization that burns but is not entirely consumed. Before writing, before pottery, before the cultivation of grain, or the domestication of animals other than dogs, before anything we associate with civilization, before any of the technologies that supposedly make complex society possible, humans built Göbekli Tepe. The stones rise from the hills of southeastern Turkey, massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, carved with animals that seem to watch from across 12,000 years. Foxes and vultures, scorpions and serpents, boars and aurochs, and creatures that resist identification. The site should not exist. Everything we thought we knew about human development suggested that monuments came after agriculture, that surplus food was necessary before communities could afford to build what was not strictly necessary for survival. Göbekli Tepe reverses the sequence, suggests that the sacred came first, that humans built temples before they built villages, that religion preceded economy. The circles count something. This much is clear from the alignments, from the positions of the pillars, from the geometries that emerge when the site is mapped and measured. The stones track celestial events, perhaps solstices, perhaps stellar positions, perhaps cycles we have not yet identified. But what else do they count? What did the builders number when they positioned these massive pillars with such precision? What was important enough to carve into stone, to invest the labor of generations, to create permanence in a world of nomadic impermanence? The carvings offer clues that deepen rather than resolve the mystery. The vultures may represent death, may indicate that the site was used for excarnation, the exposure of bodies to birds that would carry the flesh away, leaving bones that could be buried or preserved. The foxes appear frequently, seem important, but foxes hold no obvious ritual significance in later traditions of the region. The scorpions might represent constellations, might connect the earthly sight to celestial patterns, might bridge the human and the cosmic in ways we can only guess at. Most mysteriously, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried sometime around 8000 BC. The people who had maintained the site for 2000 years filled it in, covered the circles with rubble, hid the carved pillars beneath mounds that would protect them for 10,000 years until archaeologists began excavating in 1995. Why would builders bury what they had built? What knowledge was contained there that was better hidden than displayed? What changed that made the site no longer suitable for whatever purposes it had served? The burial preserved what time might otherwise have erased. The stones remain vivid, their carvings sharp, their arrangements intact, but the burial also deepened the mystery. A site that was already enigmatic becomes more so when we realize it was intentionally concealed. The builders knew what the circles meant, knew what the carvings represented, knew what was being counted, and they chose to bury that knowledge rather than pass it on. Other stone circles join this meditation. Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, its Sarsen giants hauled 20 miles, its bluestones brought 200 miles from Welsh mountains by peoples who lacked wheels and draft animals. The alignments are astronomical, solstice sunrise, solstice sunset, but the full meaning remains uncertain. Was it temple, observatory, healing sanctuary, territorial marker, something our categories cannot contain? The builders left no writing, no explanation, only the stones themselves, which speak in the language of shadow and light, in alignments that mark celestial events, in the undeniable fact that human hands place them with purposes we cannot fully recover. Karnak in Brittany stretches 3,000 standing stones across miles of landscape, rows that march beyond sight in rough parallel lines, the stones varying from knee-high to 20 feet tall. Walking among them is disorienting. The sheer number creates sense of pattern without revealing meaning, suggests intention without explaining purpose. Were they processional ways, astronomical observation lines, territorial boundaries, marking divisions we cannot now perceive? The stones do not answer. They simply stand, as they have stood for 6,000 years, counting something that was important enough to warrant such extraordinary effort, but not important enough to be explained in forms that would survive. The stone circles of Orkney, the ring of Brodgar, the stones of Stennis rise from Scottish islands, where Neolithic communities built monuments that outlasted them by millennia. The sites are connected by ceremonial landscapes, by pathways that link circles to tombs, to settlements in patterns that suggest the living and the dead. The everyday and the sacred were not separated as cleanly as modern minds assume. The builders understood their world according to principles we can partially reconstruct but cannot fully inhabit. They thought differently than we think. They counted differently than we count. They found meaning in arrangements that we can measure but cannot interpret. What were they counting? The question returns as we consider each site. solstices, and equinoxes, certainly, the turning points of the solar year that matter to any people dependent on seasons for survival. Lunar cycles, probably. The moon's phases that structure months and tides and menstrual rhythms, stellar positions, possibly. The stars that helped navigate, that predicted seasonal changes, that provided map of sky, that mapped also the year's progression. But what else? What was being counted that we no longer know how to count? Generations, perhaps, the ancestors buried nearby, the descendants expected to come, sacred cycles that connected human life to cosmic patterns we have forgotten how to perceive, relationships between places, between communities, between the living and the dead that required stone markers to maintain. The circles may have counted things that cannot be named because the names have been lost, because the concepts have not survived, because the builders thought in categories that left no trace except the stones themselves. Rest now with the thought of ancient peoples gathered within these circles, faces lit by solstice, sunrise, watching shadows align with stones their grandparents positioned. Of the moment when the count was complete, when whatever was being numbered reached its proper total, when the circle's purpose was fulfilled until the next cycle began. Of the knowledge they held that was not written, because writing did not yet exist, that was transmitted through teaching and ritual and participation, that was lost when the last person who understood died and the circles became monuments without meaning. The stones stand still. They will stand longer than we will. They count what we cannot name, mark what we cannot see, remember what we have forgotten, and in the darkness before sleep, they speak, not in words, which they predate, but in presence, in the weight of human effort invested in purposes we cannot recover, in the recognition that our ancestors knew things that were worth building monuments to preserve, even if we can no longer read what the monuments say. The circles close around us. The count continues. What is being numbered remains unnamed, and the stones keep their silence, as they have kept it for millennia, as they will keep it long after we have joined the ancestors whose names the circles may have been built to count. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis sat in his study and assembled fragments, charts from captured Portuguese vessel, maps from the age of Alexander that no longer exist, knowledge accumulated across centuries of Mediterranean and Atlantic navigation. From these sources, he compiled a map that would puzzle scholars for 500 years, because it appears to show coastlines that European explorers had not yet charted, that would not be confirmed until centuries later, that may include the outline of Antarctica as it exists beneath miles of ice. The map survives only in fragment, the western portion showing the Atlantic coasts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. What the eastern portion showed is lost, is unknowable, adds to the mystery by suggesting that more mysteries wait in what was destroyed or never preserved. But the surviving fragment is strange enough. The South American coastline is recognizable, detailed, more accurate than it should have been in 1513 when European exploration of that coast was still incomplete. The Caribbean islands are placed with precision that suggests sources more sophisticated than contemporary navigation allowed. And in the south, where South America ends, the map continues, showing a coastline that curves east, that connects to something that might be Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land that map makers hypothesized, or might be something more specific, more troubling, more wonderful. The debate over what the southern coastline represents has generated theories ranging from sober to fantastical. The sober theories suggest the coastline is simply South America's east coast, drawn at wrong angle due to compilation errors, representing nothing more mysterious than cartographic confusion. The fantastical theories suggest the coastline is Antarctica, mapped before the ice sheet formed, preserved in sources that trace to lost civilizations possessing technologies we cannot explain. Between these extremes lie intermediate positions. The coastline might represent Antarctic coast, as seen by ancient sailors who reached those waters without recording the journey, or might represent geographical speculation that happened to match reality by coincidence. Piri Reis himself offered explanation that raises as many questions as it answers. In notes on the map, he claims to have used sources including charts from the time of Alexander the Great. If such sources existed, they have not survived to our time. If they contained the accurate information the map suggests, they represent geographical knowledge that conventional history cannot account for. If they did not exist, if Piri Reis was mistaken or was claiming prestigious sources to enhance his map's authority, then the map's accuracy must be explained otherwise. The map joins other anomalous charts in the archives of geographical mystery. The Orontius Phineas map of 1513 shows Antarctica with remarkable detail, including rivers and mountains that exist beneath the ice sheet. The Boache map of 1737 shows Antarctica as two separate land masses, which is geologically accurate beneath the ice, but was not confirmed until modern ice-penetrating radar surveys. The Zeno map of 1380 shows Greenland's coastline with accuracy that seems impossible for its date. Each map raises the same questions. How did the map makers know what they seem to have known? What sources did they use that no longer exist? What knowledge was preserved through chains of copying that began in ages we cannot identify? The explanations range from mundane to mystical. The mundane, ancient sailors traveled further than we recognize, observed coastlines that were later compiled into maps, left records that have not survived except through copies and corruptions. The mystical, lost civilizations possessed technologies we cannot explain, mapped the world before catastrophes destroyed their records, left traces that survived in fragments that later map makers used without understanding their origin. Between these extremes lies uncertainty that perhaps we should not rush to resolve. The maps exist. Their accuracy, where we can check it, is sometimes remarkable and sometimes mistaken. Their sources are lost. Their implications remain debatable. The fog between explanation and mystery is thick, and perhaps the fog is appropriate. Perhaps some questions are meant to be held rather than answered, to be contemplated rather than concluded. Piri Reis himself sailed the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, commanded fleets, fought battles, was eventually executed by the Ottoman Sultan for reasons that remain unclear. His map survived when he did not, traveled through collections, was rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace Library in 1929, has generated debate ever since. The admiral who assembled fragments could not have known his work would become artifact of mystery. He was practical navigator, was compiler of useful charts, was serving immediate needs of Ottoman maritime power. That his map now generates theories about lost civilizations and ancient technologies would likely have surprised him, might have amused him, would certainly have distracted from the practical purposes the map was meant to serve. But the map exceeds its practical origins, has become symbol of what might have been known and lost, what might have been mapped and forgotten, what might have been understood by peoples whose understanding we have not preserved. The coastlines that may or may not be Antarctica point toward possibility, the possibility that the world was explored earlier than we assume, that knowledge was accumulated and transmitted through channels we have not traced, that our maps of the past are as incomplete as Piri Reis's map of the world. Rest now with the thought of the admiral in his study, charts spread before him, compiling what he could gather into synthesis that would puzzle future centuries. Of the sources he used that we cannot identify, the knowledge they contained that we cannot verify, the coastlines they show that we cannot explain, of maps as palimpsests, as layers of copying and compilation, as traces of journey that were made and recorded and transmitted until the original travelers were forgotten, but their observations remained. The map is fragment. The sources are lost. The coastlines point toward lands that may or may not have been visited by hands that held those charts long before Piri Reis assembled them in his study. The mystery remains mystery. The fog does not lift, and in the darkness before sleep, the unknown coastlines stretch toward horizons we cannot see, toward knowledge we cannot recover, toward the possibility that the world was mapped by hands whose maps we have lost, but whose outlines remain ghostly on charts that survived when understanding did not. Herculaneum is Pompeii's quieter sibling, smaller, wealthier, more completely preserved by the pyroclastic surge that killed everyone who remained, that buried the city beneath 60 feet of volcanic material, that turned wooden objects to charcoal and bodies to bone, but left, paradoxically, more of daily life intact than the slower burial of its more famous neighbor. When we enter Herculaneum, we enter not ruin, but suspension, a city caught mid-breath, preserved in the moment between normal afternoon and annihilation. The volcanic surge that buried Herculaneum in 79 CE was different from what buried Pompeii, hotter, perhaps 500 degrees Celsius, fast enough to kill instantly, violent enough to collapse roofs and walls, thorough enough to seal everything beneath material that hardened like concrete. The bodies did not decompose. They were vaporized or carbonized, leaving skeletons in postures that tell stories of final moments. The wood did not rot. It carbonized, preserving doors and furniture and the beams that held roofs up. The food did not decay. It transformed into charcoal that archaeologists can still identify. Bread in ovens, dates in bowls, fish sauce and ambergris that lined the harbor warehouses. The harbor warehouses are where we find the bodies, not in houses, not in streets, but in the boat chambers at the waterfront where hundreds gathered hoping for rescue that never came. The skeletons lie tangled, adults clutching children, groups huddled together, individuals pressed against walls as if hoping the stone might provide protection it could not offer. The postures speak of terror, of hope, of the moment when the surge arrived and everything ended. One woman clutches an infant, her bones curled protectively around smaller bones that did not survive. One man lies facing the sea, perhaps watching for boats that did not arrive in time. Groups cluster in positions suggesting they died together. Families or friends or strangers, united by shared fear and shared ending. Above the harbor, the city waited in the afternoon that became its last. The houses still contain their furnishings, carbonized beds, carbonized tables, carbonized wooden screens that divided rooms. The frescoes still show their colors, reds and blues and yellows that survived because the ash sealed them from light and air. The mosaics still cover floors that feet have not walked for 2,000 years. Dolphins and geometric patterns and images of gods who could not protect their worshippers. The baths still hold their fixtures, taps and drains and heating systems that reveal sophistication we do not always expect from ancient plumbing. The villa of the papyri is where the mystery deepens. This grand house, probably owned by Julius Caesar's father-in-law, contained a library, scrolls stored in wooden cabinets that the surge carbonized along with everything else. The scrolls survive as charred cylinders, their papyrus transformed to carbon, their ink preserved within layers that cannot be unrolled without destruction. For centuries, attempts to read them produced only fragments, pieces that broke off when conservators tried to open what the volcano had sealed shut. The fragments suggested philosophy, suggested Epicurean texts, suggested that the library contained works that might include writings lost since antiquity. Recent technology has begun to change what is possible. CT scanning can detect ink within the carbonized rolls without unrolling them. Machine learning can identify letter forms from density differences invisible to human eyes. The scrolls are beginning to yield their secrets, and the secrets are extraordinary. New texts by Philodemus, the Epicurean philosopher, possibly works by other authors whose writings did not survive in the manuscript tradition, possibly the only copies of texts that were lost when the libraries that held them were destroyed, or when the copies that preserved them were not made. What waits in the unopened scrolls? The question haunts anyone who contemplates the library. Perhaps only texts we already possess, duplicates of works that survived through other channels. Perhaps philosophical treatises that would reshape our understanding of ancient thought. Perhaps historical accounts that would fill gaps in our knowledge of the Roman world. Perhaps literature, plays, poems, memoirs that would open windows into lives we can otherwise only imagine. The scrolls have waited 2,000 years. They are beginning to speak. What they will say remains uncertain. But Herculaneum itself speaks. Whether or not the scrolls yield their secrets, speaks of daily life interrupted, of meals that were being prepared when the mountain exploded, of business transactions that were underway when the ashfall began, of children who were playing, and adults who were working, and couples who were loving when the surge arrived and time stopped. The city is not ruin in the way that collapsed temples are ruins. It is more like a scene frozen, a moment preserved, a breath held for 2 millennia and not yet released. The streets are narrow, designed for pedestrians, more than carts, lined with shops that still display their marble counters and their carbonized goods. The houses are smaller than Pompeii's grand villas, but more intact, their upper stories preserved where Pompeii's collapsed, their interiors giving sense of how Romans actually lived rather than how they wished to be remembered. The public buildings suggest a community that valued its civic life, the theater, the baths, the palestra, where young men exercised. But the scale is intimate, is human, is recognizable in ways that imperial monuments are not. Rest now with the thought of that final afternoon, of the mountain that had been quiet for so long that no one remembered it was volcano, of the ash that began falling, that prompted evacuation, that sent residents to the harbor hoping boats would come, of the surge that followed, not ash, but superheated gas and rock moving faster than anyone could run, killing everything it touched in the time between heartbeats, of the city sealed by catastrophe, preserved by destruction, waiting beneath layers of volcanic stone for excavators who would not come for 17 centuries. The city sleeps still. Excavation is ongoing, is incomplete, has revealed perhaps a third of what lies buried. The rest waits. More houses, more bodies, more secrets, more scrolls that may contain words we have lost and will be grateful to recover. The volcano gave Herculaneum a terrible gift: preservation through annihilation, survival through death, a legacy that emerges from disaster Sleep now, as the city sleeps. Dream of streets that emptied too late, of harbors where hope died, of libraries whose wisdom waited in darkness for technologies that could read without destroying. The city sleeps. Its secrets slowly wake, and in the space between catastrophe and recovery, between burial and revelation, the breath that was held 2,000 years ago begins, finally, to be released. The fishermen of Cornwall speak of hearing bells, church bells, they say, ringing from beneath the waves, from the drowned land of Lyonesse that once stretched between Land's End and the Scilly Isles. The legend tells of a kingdom that flourished where water now flows, of churches and villages that were swallowed in a single catastrophic night when the sea broke through defenses that had held for centuries. The bells ring still, the fishermen say, on quiet nights, when the wind is right, when the sea is willing to share its secrets. The legend is old. The first written references to Lyonesse date to the medieval period, when Arthurian romance placed the land as Tristan's kingdom, as a realm lost to the sea, as part of Britain's mythological geography. But the legend may be older still, may preserve memory of actual inundations during the millennia since the last ice age ended, when sea levels rose over 100 meters and coastlines retreated, when lands that had been dry became shallow seas and then deep water. Doggerland is the name scientists give to the territory that once connected Britain to continental Europe. Until roughly 8,000 years ago, it was dry land, low-lying plain where Mesolithic peoples hunted and gathered, where settlements existed whose remains are occasionally dragged up in fishing nets, where mammoths once roamed and humans followed them. The land did not sink in a night. It drowned over centuries, over millennia, the rising seas claiming first the lowest ground, then the higher, until only islands remained, and then not even islands. The inhabitants must have noticed, must have seen familiar coastlines retreat, must have told stories about land that had been dry in their grandparents' time, must have wondered if the waters would ever stop rising. Did they ring bells? They had no bells. Bells are technology that came later, but they had rituals, had ceremonies, had ways of marking what was sacred that we cannot recover. When the waters rose, they must have left offerings, must have said prayers, must have tried to appease whatever forces they believed controlled the sea's advance. When the last dry ground disappeared, the last inhabitants must have paddled or sailed to lands that remained, must have carried with them memories of what was lost, must have told stories that transformed over generations until the specific became legendary, until the memories of Doggerland became the myths of Lyonesse. The bells we hear, if we hear them, are echoes of that loss, are sounds that travel through water more easily than through air, that might be fishing equipment clanging, might be boats at anchor, might be nothing more than wind and wave combining in ways that suggest what they do not contain, but they might also be memory made audible, the persistence of loss in a form that reaches across millennia, the refusal of the drowned land to be entirely forgotten. Other drowned lands join this meditation. The legend of Is off the Breton coast, a city protected by dikes until the king's daughter betrayed its defenses and the sea rushed in. The legend of Contra Gwelod in Wales, another kingdom lost to the waves when a drunken prince neglected the gates. The myths share structure: a protected land, a human failure, a catastrophic flooding, and that shared structure might reflect shared experience, might preserve in legendary form the actual inundations that made northwestern Europe's coastline what it is today. Atlantis, of course, is the most famous drowned land. Plato described it as powerful island nation, destroyed by the gods for its hubris, sunk beneath the waves in a single night of earthquakes and floods. Whether Plato was describing actual historical catastrophe, the volcanic destruction of Minoan Thera, perhaps, or some other Mediterranean disaster, or was creating philosophical parable using invented geography, remains debated. But the legend resonates because the drowning is real. Lands have been lost, are being lost, will continue to be lost as sea levels rise and coastlines retreat. The bells ring in Cornwall. In Brittany, the bells of Ease are said to ring on Christmas Eve, calling the faithful to services in churches that no longer exist above the waves. In Wales, the bells of Contra Gwelod ring to warn of storms, to remind the living that the dead were not entirely lost, that what is submerged is not entirely silent. The bells are memory transformed into sound, loss transformed into presence. The drowned lands calling to the lands that remain. What do the bells say? They say that water wins, that coastlines are temporary, that what is built can be drowned, what is inhabited can be abandoned, what is loved can be lost. They say that the sea keeps what it takes, that the drowned lands still exist beneath the waves, that the churches and villages and fields and forests are still there, transformed by salt and time and darkness, but not destroyed. They say that memory persists, that loss is not forgetting, that the bells ring because someone somewhere still remembers what was submerged. Rest now with the sound of bells in the distance. Not loud, barely audible, more felt than heard, more suspected than certain. The kind of sound that might be imagined, might be remembered, might be created by the same impulse that creates legends from losses and myths from memories. The bells ring across the water that was once land. They ring from churches whose congregations dispersed millennia ago. They ring for the dead who drowned and the living who remember them. The fog rolls in from the sea that covers Lyonesse. The water that drowned Doggerland laps against shores that were once hills above dry land. The tide rises and falls as it has risen and fallen since the drowning began, since the waters claimed what they claim still, since the bells began their ringing and have not stopped. Sleep now with the bells. Let them ring you into deeper rest, into dreams of lands beneath waves, of churches beneath water, of lives that were lived where fish now swim. The bells ring. The drowned lands wait. And somewhere between waking and sleeping, between hearing and imagining, the memory of what was lost sounds faintly across the water, calling, perhaps, to those who can still hear what the sea has not silenced. The symbols stare back at us from clay and stone and wood. They meant something. This much is certain. Someone carved them deliberately, arranged them in patterns, believed that the symbols would communicate meaning to someone else, but that someone else is gone. The language they spoke is silent. The meanings they intended are locked within symbols that have become beautiful and mute, present but inaccessible, testimony to thought that cannot be recovered. Linear A covers tablets from ancient Crete, administrative records mostly, the accounting of an economy sophisticated enough to require written tracking. The symbols are clear, are countable, are recognizable as writing system rather than mere decoration, but the language they encode is unknown. Linear B, the script that replaced Linear A in Mycenaean Crete, was deciphered in 1952, turned out to be archaic Greek, unlocking a literature and an administration that had been silent for 3,000 years. But Linear A is not Greek, is not any language we can identify, is locked behind script we can see and language we cannot hear. The Minoans, who used Linear A, built Knossos, built the palaces that later Greeks associated with the labyrinth, built a civilization that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. They traded with Egypt and Mesopotamia, received goods and probably ideas from across the known world, created art that still startles with its sophistication and beauty. And they wrote. They kept records. They probably had literature, had religious texts, had thoughts that seemed worth preserving in written form. All of that is lost. The symbols remain, but the sounds they represented, the words they formed, the meanings they conveyed, all this is silence. The Indus Valley script presents similar mystery on larger scale. The seals and tablets of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro bear symbols that appear frequently enough to suggest standardized writing system, that appear in contexts that suggest administrative or religious use, that remain stubbornly undeciphered despite generations of scholarly effort. The civilization that used these symbols planned cities with geometric precision, built drainage systems that would not be matched for millennia, traded with Mesopotamia across the Indian Ocean. They were not simple. They were not primitive. They thought things worth writing down. But what they thought, what they wrote, what the symbols mean, all this is unknown. Part of the difficulty is statistical. The Indus texts are short, rarely more than a few symbols, providing insufficient material for the pattern analysis that decipherment requires. Part of the difficulty is linguistic. We do not know what language family Indus script encoded, cannot guess at sound values, cannot work backward from known languages as Champollion worked backward from Greek to decipher hieroglyphs. Part of the difficulty may be fundamental. Some scholars argue Indus symbols are not writing at all, not encoding of spoken language, but something else: emblems, ownership marks, religious symbols that communicated meaning without representing speech. If Indus script is not writing, then seeking to read it is category error, is asking the wrong question, is searching for meanings in symbols that do not work the way writing works. But if it is writing, then waiting within those symbols are the thoughts of people who built one of the world's great early civilizations, who organized sophisticated urban life, who had ideas about the world that we cannot access because the symbols they use to encode those ideas have not yielded their secrets. Rongo Rongo presents Mystery in Miniature. The wooden tablets from Easter Island bear symbols that appear to be writing, rows of figures, some resembling humans or animals or plants, arranged in patterns that suggest systematic use. But the tablets are few. The symbols are many. The statistical base is inadequate for decipherment. Worse, the European missionaries who arrived in the 19th century destroyed most tablets as pagan artifacts, asked too late whether anyone could still read them, received conflicting answers from islanders who may have known the truth or may have been inventing answers to satisfy questioners. The last person who definitely could read Rongo Rongo died in the 19th century, taking with them whatever the tablets said. What did they say? The theories proliferate: genealogies, astronomical observations, religious chants, historical records. The tablets may have contained knowledge crucial to Easter Island's remarkable culture, the culture that carved and erected the moai, that sustained complex society on isolated island, that collapsed for reasons still debated. The tablets may have explained what outsiders can only speculate about: how the statues were moved, what they represented, why the culture declined. Or the tablets may have contained only administrative trivia, only records of transactions, only the mundane business of civilization that seems sacred only because it is lost. Other undeciphered scripts join this meditation: the Etruscan language, written in alphabet we can read, but expressing meanings we cannot fully recover because too few texts survive, and the language has no known relatives. The Meroitic script of ancient Nubia, whose alphabetic nature is understood, but whose language remains obscure. The scripts of Byblos and Proto-Sinaitic, transitional forms that helped generate the alphabet we use today, but whose texts we cannot read. Each represents voices silenced by time, thoughts preserved in symbols that have become opaque, the frustrating presence of meaning that is present but inaccessible. Rest now with the symbols, with the tablets and seals and stones that bear marks made by human hands with human intentions, with the silence where meaning should be, where sound once was, where language was spoken that we cannot recreate. The symbols are beautiful in their mystery, are precious in their opacity, are testimony to the fact that humans have always written and that writing is fragile, is dependent on chains of transmission that can be broken, is lost when languages die, and no one remembers the sounds that the symbols represented. The scripts wait. They have waited for centuries, for millennia, for as long as they will need to wait until someone finds the key or acknowledges that no key will be found. They speak in silence, communicate incomprehensibly, preserve what cannot be recovered, and in the darkness before sleep, the symbols float before closed eyes. Linear A, Indus seals, Rongo Rongo glyphs, waiting to be read, waiting to speak, waiting with patience that exceeds human patience for the understanding that may never come. The maps of medieval and Renaissance Europe showed roads leading to cities that were never found, paths winding toward Prester John's Christian kingdom, rumored to lie beyond the Islamic world, ruled by a priest king who commanded armies of centaurs and elephants, who possessed mirrors that showed distant events, who held treasures that would fund crusades and convert the heathen, trails to Cibola's 7 cities of gold, where wealth beyond imagination supposedly waited for conquistadors brave enough to cross the deserts of the American Southwest, routes to El Dorado, the gilded king who covered himself in gold dust each morning and washed it off each evening in a sacred lake, whose kingdom held more gold than Europe had ever seen. The cities were never found because they did not exist, or they existed only as misunderstandings, only as legends transformed through multiple tellings, only as hopes projected onto blank spaces in maps that needed filling. Prester John may have been confused memory of Nestorian Christian communities in Central Asia, or may have been diplomatic invention designed to encourage European expansion against Islamic powers. Cibola was likely the Zuni pueblos of New Mexico, which gleamed in certain light but held no gold, which were conquered by Coronado in 1540 only to yield disappointment rather than wealth. El Dorado was probably Muisca chieftains of Colombia who did practice gold dust rituals, but whose wealth was modest by European imagination's standards. But the roads were real. The expeditions mounted to find these cities were real. The lives lost in deserts and jungles and mountains, searching for places that did not exist, were real. The roads that lead to cities never found are paved with the bones of those who believed the maps, who trusted the legends, who could not conceive that such detailed stories might be fabricated from nothing. The Mandeville travels of the 14th century described lands beyond the known world in extraordinary detail, described races of dog-headed men, of one-legged shaders who use their single large foot as parasol against desert sun, of trees whose fruit became birds when it ripened. The descriptions were false, were invented, were compiled from earlier fantasies, were travel writing about places the author almost certainly never visited, but the book was believed, was consulted as geography, was carried by Columbus on his voyages, shaping expectations that the New World would confirm what the Old World had imagined. The unmapped spaces on medieval maps were not blank. They were filled with possibilities, with sea monsters at the edges, with mysterious kingdoms at the margins, with everything that European imagination needed to project beyond what European experience had confirmed. The blank spaces were not admissions of ignorance, but were invitations to fantasy, were places where hopes could be located because facts had not yet contradicted them. What drove the seeking? Gold, certainly. The wealth that awaited whoever found the legendary cities would be immense, would fund empires, would transform the finder from mortal to legendary. Power, equally, the alliances that Prester John's Christian kingdom could provide against Islamic enemies, the strategic advantage of territories that linked east and west, but also something deeper, the need to believe that somewhere beyond the known, something wonderful waited, that the world was not fully mapped, not fully understood, not fully disenchanted, that mystery survived at the margins, that marvels existed beyond horizons, that roads still led to cities yet undiscovered. The roads continue in our imagination, not to cities of gold now. We have mapped the world too thoroughly for such fantasies to survive, but to other impossibilities, other projections beyond the known. The cities were never found, but the seeking shaped history. The expeditions mounted to find Cibola conquered actual peoples, destroyed actual cultures, created actual colonies that became actual nations. The legend was false. The consequences were real. The road to the city never found led somewhere after all, just not to where the seekers intended. Rest now with the maps spread before you, with the roads winding toward destinations that do not exist, with the seekers who followed those roads, who believed what the maps showed, who died in deserts, still searching for golden walls that appeared only in stories. The roads are beautiful in their impossibility, are poignant in their failure, are testimony to the human capacity to hope for what cannot be found. The cities were never built. The gold was never mined. The kingdoms were never ruled. But the maps that showed them were carefully drawn, were consulted by serious people, were believed with conviction that seems touching and dangerous in equal measure. The roads led to nowhere. The journeys changed everything. Sleep now with the unbuilt cities glowing faintly in imagination, with the gold that never existed gleaming just beyond the horizon, with the roads that led to disappointment, but also to discovery, to conquest, to the complicated history that emerged from seeking what was never there. The cities never found, the roads never ending, the seeking that continues, perhaps even in sleep, even in dreams, even in the deepest rest where imagination still reaches toward what it has not yet found. They sealed the tombs against what might come, against thieves, against demons, against the uncertainties of an afterlife they believed in, but could not verify. They placed provisions within, food and drink, weapons and jewelry, servants and horses, everything the dead might need. for journeys beyond this world. They closed the doors, covered the entrances, built mountains over the chambers where kings slept with their treasures. They trusted the seals to hold. The seals did not hold. Tomorrow came anyway, and tomorrow found them. The Scythian kurgans of the Central Asian steppes held chieftains who were buried with their horses, with their weapons, with the gold ornaments that marked their status among the living and their expectations for the dead. The burial mounds scattered across Kazakhstan and southern Russia are grassy hills now, but beneath the grass lie chambers that preserve what gentler climates would have destroyed. The Pazyryk burials in Siberia, sealed in ice that formed naturally within the burial mounds, preserved not just metal and bone, but flesh and fabric, tattooed chieftains whose skin still shows the animals that decorated it, felted textiles in colors that have not faded in 2.5 millennia, horses that still wear the masks they were dressed in for burial. The ice was accident, was not planned by the builders, was not part of their intention, but the accident preserved what intention could not protect. The seals were broken anyway. Tomb robbers reached many burials before archaeologists could. But what the robbers did not take, what they did not value, what remained when they departed, this the ice preserved. This we can study. This speaks to us across distances that words could not bridge, because these people left no writing. The Egyptian tombs were sealed with prayers as well as stone, with spells that promised suffering to any who disturbed the dead, that threatened curses on generations to come, that invoked gods whose power to protect was, in the event, insufficient. The Valley of the Kings holds tombs of pharaohs who expected to rest in peace until the resurrection they believed would come. They did not expect to be excavated by foreigners, to be displayed in museums, to have their bodies examined by technologies that would have seemed magical. They sealed against tomorrow. Tomorrow brought Howard Carter and Tutankhamun's treasure and the endless procession of tourists who view what was meant to be hidden forever. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, built himself a tomb that has not been fully opened. The terracotta warriors guard the approach. 8,000 life-size clay soldiers discovered in 1974, each face unique, each positioned as if for battle, protecting their emperor across millennia. But the burial chamber itself, where the emperor's body presumably rests, surrounded by treasures that ancient historians described in extravagant detail, rivers of mercury, palaces in miniature, crossbows rigged to kill intruders, this chamber remains sealed. Modern surveys have detected mercury concentrations, suggesting the ancient descriptions might be accurate. But Chinese authorities have chosen not to excavate, have chosen to wait for technologies that can preserve what opening might destroy. The restraint is remarkable. The curiosity must be intense. To know what lies within, to see whether the ancient descriptions were true. to view the treasures that the first emperor gathered for his eternal use. But the restraint acknowledges what the original sealing could not achieve, that what is opened cannot be unopened, that what is exposed may be destroyed by the exposure, that patience might preserve what haste would ruin. The tomb remains sealed. Tomorrow has not yet come for that chamber. The emperor waits as he intended to wait, though not as long as he intended to wait. The ship burials of Scandinavia sealed warriors within vessels that were meant to carry them to the afterlife. Sutton Hoo in England, Oseberg in Norway, the boat graves scattered across the Baltic world. Each contained bodies surrounded by treasures, provisions for journeys beyond the edge of the world, equipment for afterlife imagined as voyage across unknown waters. The ships were buried, were covered with mounds, were sealed against disturbance. The seals failed. The ships were found. The treasures reside in museums where they teach us about cultures that did not document themselves otherwise. What did the builders believe as they closed the tombs? They believed the seals would hold. This much is certain. They believed the dead would rest undisturbed, would have use of what was buried with them, would journey safely to whatever destination awaited. They believed in tomorrows that would respect what they had prepared, that would honor the provisions they had made, that would leave the dead in peace they had worked to ensure. The tomorrows that came were different than the tomorrows they imagined, were tomorrows that valued knowledge over rest, that preferred discovery to privacy, that opened what had been sealed and studied what had been hidden, were tomorrows that brought archaeologists rather than resurrections, museums rather than afterlives, understanding rather than the uses the dead had intended. Rest now with the thought of sealed chambers, of doors that were closed with finality by hands that believed the closing would be permanent, of treasures placed in darkness with expectation that darkness would protect them forever. The seals broke. The tomorrows came. What was hidden was revealed. What was meant for the dead became property of the living. But the tombs still speak of the intention, still testify to the care that was taken, to the beliefs that were held, to the love. For what else would drive such elaborate preparation that the living felt for the dead they were burying? The seals failed to keep tomorrow out, but they did not fail entirely. They preserved what they held until the tomorrows that found them could appreciate what they had kept. They sealed against tomorrow. Tomorrow came. But tomorrow also understood, in its way, what the sealing had meant. Sleep now with the tombs, with the sealed chambers that wait still to be opened, that have been opened, that will be opened in time, with the tomorrow that always comes, that cannot be sealed out, that finds what is hidden and brings it to light. The tombs rest, the dead rest, and in the darkness before sleep, the seals hold a little longer against the morning that always arrives. They watch to the sky. Before cities, before writing, before all the technologies we associate with civilization, humans watched the ski. They marked where the sun rose on the longest day, where it rose on the shortest. They counted the days between one full moon and the next. They tracked the wandering stars, the planets, across the fixed star patterns. They built monuments that aligned with celestial events, that captured starlight and moonlight in chambers designed for the purpose, that demonstrated astronomical knowledge so sophisticated we struggle to explain how it was acquired. Chanquillo rises from the Peruvian desert, 13 towers arranged along a ridge marking the sun's annual journey along the horizon. From observation points below, the sunrise moves from tower to tower as the year progresses, creating calendar in stone, marking solstices and equinoxes with precision that required generations of careful watching. The towers are 2,000 years old, were built by a civilization that left no written explanation, that preserved their astronomical knowledge in architecture rather than texts, that trusted stone to remember what human memory might forget. Newgrange in Ireland predates Stonehenge by 1,000 years. The passage tomb's most remarkable feature is the light box above the entrance, a carefully constructed aperture positioned so that at winter solstice sunrise for 17 minutes, sunlight penetrates the 60-foot passage and illuminates the chamber at its heart. The precision required to achieve this alignment is extraordinary. The builders had to understand not just where the sun rose on the solstice, but how its light would behave as it traveled through narrowing passage, had to construct the aperture at exactly the right angle, had to trust that their calculations would prove correct, even though they could verify only once a year. Why winter solstice? The darkest time, the shortest day, the moment when the sun seems weakest and the return to light seems most in doubt. The illumination of Newgrange's chamber at that moment may have been reassurance, demonstration that the sun would return, that darkness would give way to light, that the cosmic order could be trusted, even when evidence seemed sparse. Or the illumination may have been practical, marker for agricultural planning, signal for ceremonies that brought communities together at the year's turning, or the illumination may have meant something else entirely, something our categories cannot contain. Angkor Wat aligns its towers with the spring equinox. At sunrise on that date, the sun rises directly over the central tower, creating visual effect that would have been deliberately impressive. The temple and the cosmos in perfect alignment, the sacred architecture participating in cosmic events, the human and the celestial joined in a moment that occurred exactly twice each year. The builders intended this, calculated for it, created architecture that was also astronomy, that functioned as observatory even as it functioned as temple. The Mayan observatories at Chichen Itza and elsewhere tracked Venus with precision that exceeds casual interest. The Dresden Codex, one of the few Maya books that survived Spanish destruction, contains Venus tables accurate to within 2 hours over 5 centuries. astronomical predictions that required centuries of observation, careful record keeping, mathematical sophistication that challenged European capabilities at the time of contact. Why Venus? Perhaps because Venus as morning and evening star seemed to die and be reborn, connecting planetary motion to cycles of death and resurrection that Maya religion emphasized. Perhaps because Venus's cycle, 263 days as evening star, 50 days invisible, 263 days as morning star, 8 days invisible, created patterns that Maya mathematics found particularly suitable for their base 20 counting system. What did they know that we have forgotten? The question haunts consideration of ancient observatories. Modern astronomers can calculate celestial events with precision that ancient observers could not match. But modern astronomers use instruments, use mathematics, use accumulated knowledge that was built on foundations that ancient observers laid. The ancient observers had only eyes, remarkable eyes trained by generations of watching, and had patience we can barely imagine, the willingness to watch night after night for years and decades and lifetimes, building knowledge that could be transmitted only through teaching, preserved only through monuments that aligned with what words might fail to convey. The night sky they watched was different than the night sky we see, was darker, was fuller, was unpolluted by the artificial light that dims our view of stars. They could see the Milky Way clearly, could track meteors and comets, could perceive patterns and motions that require deliberate effort for modern observers to notice. Their relationship with the sky was intimate in ways ours cannot be. They knew the night sky the way we know our neighborhoods, every feature familiar, every change notable, every pattern significant. Rest now under that ancient sky, under stars that have moved slightly in the millennia since the observatories were built. Precession has shifted the alignments, has made some ancient observations less accurate than they once were, has demonstrated that even celestial permanence is relative. The observatories remain. The alignments persist, mostly. The knowledge they embodied, the patient watching, the careful recording, the transmission across generations persists in the monuments that preserve it. The sun will rise tomorrow, will move along the horizon as it has always moved, returning to positions marked by ancient towers, entering chambers designed to receive it, participating in alignments that were planned millennia ago. The observers are gone, their names are lost, but their watching persists in stone, in the observatories that captured celestial knowledge in forms that endure. Sleep now with the sky turning above, with the stars wheeling as they have always wheeled, as ancient observers watch them wheel, as the observatories they built continue to track. The cosmos continues its motions, the monuments continue their watching, and in the darkness before sleep, the alignments hold, stone and starlight, architecture and astronomy, the patient observation of those who knew the sky better than we know our own neighborhoods, who built in stone what they had learned through watching, who trusted monuments to remember what living memory might forget. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon may never have existed, or they existed in Nineveh, not Babylon, built by Assyrian kings rather than Babylonian, or they existed smaller than legend suggests, impressive but not miraculous, beautiful but not impossible, or they existed exactly as described, terraces rising like green mountains above the flat Mesopotamian plain, water lifted from the Euphrates by screws or chains, plants from mountain regions flourishing in desert heat because human ingenuity created conditions they required. The uncertainty is appropriate. Gardens are ephemeral, plants die, irrigation fails, soil erodes, empires collapse, and no one maintains what the empire built. If the Hanging Gardens existed, they would have required constant attention, water lifted daily, plants replaced seasonally, structures maintained against the weight of soil and the pressure of roots. When attention ended, when Babylon fell, when the gardeners departed, when no one remained who cared what grew, the gardens would have failed quickly. Within years, the plants would have died. Within decades, the structures would have crumbled. Within centuries, nothing would have remained but the legend, the memory, the description in Greek sources of something that Greek eyes may never have seen. But the desire to create gardens in impossible places is real, is persistent, is visible across cultures and centuries, wherever humans have gathered enough surplus to invest in beauty rather than merely in survival. The Persian paradise gardens that gave us the word paradise were irrigated enclosures in arid landscapes, green refuges from dust and heat, places where kings received ambassadors and lovers met beneath trees that should not have grown there. The Roman pleasure gardens required aqueducts, required engineering, required the infrastructure of empire to provide water that nature did not supply. The floating gardens of Tenochtitlan amazed Spanish conquistadors who had never seen anything like them. The Chinampas, artificial islands built in Lake Texcoco, anchored by tree roots, fertilized by lake bottom muck, producing vegetables and flowers in quantities that fed a city of perhaps 200,000, were agriculture and gardening combined, practical and beautiful, engineered and organic. The Aztecs grew paradise in the middle of a lake because they had no other land to grow it on, because necessity drove innovation, because the desire for green and growing things was strong enough to build islands for them. What drives the garden building? Not necessity alone. The most elaborate garden serve no nutritional purpose, produce no essential crops, exist only for beauty and for the display of power that creating beauty requires. The Mughal gardens of India, the classical gardens of China and Japan, the formal gardens of European palaces, all represent resources that might have been used otherwise, labor that might have been directed elsewhere, water and soil, and attention that might have fed the hungry rather than pleased the powerful. But the gardens represent something else as well, represent the human need for green. In places where green does not grow naturally, represent the desire to cultivate rather than merely to collect, to grow rather than merely to gather, to create conditions where beauty can flourish, rather than simply to enjoy beauty where it happens to occur. The gardens are acts of faith, faith that seeds will sprout, that water will continue flowing, that the careful balance of conditions required for plants to thrive can be maintained against drought and disease and the entropy that claims all cultivated things. The hanging gardens, if they existed, represented this faith in extreme form, faith that water could be lifted high enough, that soil could be supported adequately, that mountain plants could be convinced to grow in desert heat if desert heat was mitigated by sufficient water and shade, faith that the empire would persist long enough to maintain what was built, that gardeners would continue their work generation after generation, that the beauty created would be worth the resources consumed. The empire did not persist. The gardens, if they existed, failed. The legend alone remains, the memory of impossible green rising above the plain, the story of what was achieved, even if achievement could not be sustained. Rest now with gardens in imagination, with terraces rising green against dusty sky, with water falling through channels designed to cool and to nourish, with plants blooming in impossible profusion, jasmine and rose, palm and pomegranate, all the beauty that desert does not naturally provide, conjured by engineering and maintained by labor and lost when empire collapsed and no one remained to tend what empire had built. The gardens grew in impossible places, grew because humans wanted them to grow, needed beauty where nature provided only dust, invested resources that seem excessive until we recognize what the investment represented, the persistent human desire to cultivate paradise, to create Eden, to make the desert bloom. Sleep now with the gardens, with the green that grew against all odds, with the water that flowed where water should not have flowed, the flowers that bloomed where flowers should not have bloomed, the beauty that was created and was lost and is remembered still in legends that may or may not be true, but that express truths whether or not they report facts. The gardens fell, but the desire that built them persists. The gardens of today continue the tradition, less grandiose perhaps, but no less driven by the same need that drove the builders of the hanging gardens, the same faith that desert can be made to bloom, the same love for green and growing things that has led humans to cultivate beauty wherever we have gathered. Before Edison, there was no way to preserve sound, or so we believed. Sound was ephemeral, waves in air that dissipated as soon as the source stopped vibrating, traces that left no trace, voices that could not be bottled, music that could not be captured. We had notation, had written descriptions of sounds, had memory of what we had heard, but we could not replay, could not hear again what had been spoken once, could not preserve the voice as we could preserve the face in portrait or the word in manuscript. Then came the phonautograph, invented in 1857 by Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville. The device traced sound waves onto paper blackened with soot, creating visual record of audio vibrations. Scott never intended to play the recordings back. The technology for playback did not exist, and he was interested in visualization rather than reproduction. The squiggles on the smoked paper were meant to be studied, not heard. They were silent witnesses to sound, traces without voices. But in 2008, researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory used optical imaging to read those 19th century squiggles. They found the sound within the silence. They played back what had been recorded and never intended to be played. And from across a century and a half, a voice emerged. Au clair de la lune, mon ami Pierrot, a French folk song recorded in Tinsolkoi, the oldest known recording of human voice. The voice is thin, is ghostly, is barely recognizable as singing. The technology that recovered it required computers and algorithms that would have seemed magical to Scott. But the voice is there, was always there, encoded in scratches on soot blackened paper, waiting for technology that could hear what had been recorded. What else might be waiting? The question haunts anyone who contemplates the phone autograph recordings. If sounds from Isti could be recovered, what about sounds from earlier? What about sounds that were never deliberately recorded, but might have been accidentally preserved? Vibrations etched into surfaces by chance rather than intention, voices captured in media that we have not yet learned to read. The theories are mostly speculative. Some would say fantastical. Pottery might preserve sound. The grooves left by tools as the pot turned might encode ambient sound, might contain voices of potters long dead, might play back if we could find the right stylus at the right speed. Paintings might preserve sound. The brush strokes might contain vibrations transmitted through the brush as the painter worked, might encode conversations, might hold voices if we could decode what the bristles recorded. The theories are almost certainly wrong. The physics argues against it. The encoding would be too faint. The noise would overwhelm the signal. The accidental recordings would be unrecoverable even if they existed. But the hope persists. The desire to hear the past, to recover voices that were silenced by time, to break the barrier that separates us from everyone who lived before recording technology. This desire shapes the theories, even when the theories cannot be confirmed. What would we give to hear voices from the past? To hear Shakespeare's pronunciation, Socrates' arguments, the Buddha's teaching voice, Jesus' Aramaic, Caesar's Latin? To hear not just the words, which we have in many cases, but the sounds, the rhythms, the emphases, the living voice that no text can preserve. The desire is intense, is perhaps universal, is the same desire that drives us to visit ruins and read inscriptions and imagine the people who once walked where we walk now. The phonotogram suggests that recovery is possible, that sounds thought lost can be found. that technology can unlock what previous technology could not. The dead can speak if their voices were recorded, if we can find the records, if we can develop methods to read them. The silence is not absolute. The barrier is not complete. Rest now, with the thought of voices waiting, of sounds recorded and not yet recovered, of words spoken and not yet heard again, of the past calling to the present through channels we have not yet identified. The phonautograph recordings were known for over a century before anyone heard them. What else is waiting? What other voices persist in silence, encoded in media we do not recognize, waiting for technologies we have not invented? The Edison cylinder, the gramophone record, the magnetic tape, the digital file. Each technology has captured voices that persist as long as the media persist and the playback devices exist. But the older recordings are the most precious, are the nearest to the silence that preceded recording, are the voices closest to the barrier that separates the documented from the undocumented. Sleep now with the voices, with the song from ancestor to thin and ghostly, but recognizably human, bridging a gap that once seemed unbridgeable, with the possibility, slim, perhaps impossible, but persistent, that other gaps might be bridged, that other silences might yield voices, that the past might speak if we learn to listen properly. The voices fade, the wax degrades, the silence that preceded recording extends back through all of human history, through all the words spoken and songs sung and arguments made and prayers offered that no technology could capture. But within that silence, perhaps, traces persist. Wait for technologies we cannot imagine. Speak in frequencies we cannot yet hear. Sleep now. The voices wait. The silence holds. And somewhere in the space between what is recorded and what is lost, the past continues calling. Quiet, patient, hoping that the future will finally hear what it has been trying to say. Conclusion. Where morning waits, the archives close. The drowned cities continue their submarine rest. The burned libraries persist only in what was copied before the flames arrived. The stone circles count celestial events in languages we have forgotten how to read. The maps point toward coastlines we cannot explain. The tombs yield their contents to tomorrows they were sealed against. The voices, preserved in wax and silence, wait for technologies that might finally hear them. We have journeyed through 12 chambers of uncertainty tonight, 12 spaces where knowledge meets mystery, where evidence meets legend, where what we know meets what we cannot know. We have not solved the mysteries. They do not admit solution, or the solutions would diminish them, would reduce wonder to explanation, would transform mystery into mere fact. We have instead sat with the mysteries, have felt their weight, have recognized that uncertainty is not always obstacle, but is sometimes invitation, not problem to be solved, but presence to be honored. What have we learned? That human achievement is remarkable and human preservation is fragile, that what was built can be drowned, what was written can be burned, what was understood can be forgotten, that the libraries we rely on have predecessors that were destroyed, that the knowledge we assume has always been known was often lost and rediscovered, that the chain of transmission by which wisdom reaches us from the past is thinner than we usually acknowledge. But we have also learned that memory persists, that legends preserve truths even when they distort facts, that drowned cities leave traces, that burned libraries left copies, that forgotten languages sometimes yield to patient decipherment, that what seems lost is sometimes only waiting, waiting for excavation, for decoding, for technologies that can read what earlier technologies could not. Morning approaches. The darkness in which we have wandered will give way to light. The mysteries we have contemplated will retreat to the margins of attention as daily concerns reassert themselves. But the mysteries will remain, will continue existing whether we attend to them or not, will wait as they have waited for centuries and millennia, for whatever attention the future might bring. Rest now with what you have heard, with the harbors drowned and the libraries burned, and the scripts undeciphered, and the gardens fallen, with the observatories still watching skies that have shifted since they were built, with the tombs opened and the tombs still sealed, with the voices that were recorded and the voices that were lost, with all the knowledge that the world forgot and all the knowledge that waits, perhaps to be recovered. Morning will come, will bring its own concerns, its own demands, its own insistence on the present at the expense of the past. But the past will be there when you return to it, will be waiting in the archives, in the ruins, in the mysteries that do not resolve but do not disappear. Sleep now, sleep deeply, sleep with the drowned archives open to your dreaming, their water-damaged pages offering what they can, their silence speaking in the language silence speaks of what was lost, what waits to be found, what will remain forever hidden in the space between what the world remembers and what the world forgot. The archives close, morning waits, and somewhere in the depths of ocean, of earth, of memory itself, the forgotten continues its patient existence, neither fully lost nor fully preserved, neither entirely silent nor clearly speaking, waiting with the patience that only the forgotten possesses for attention that may or may not come. Good night. The mysteries remain mysteries. The silence continues. And in the morning, should you choose to remember, the drowned archives will still be there, waiting, as they have always waited, for those who wish to dive beneath the waves and see what the waters have kept.